Welcome to Ferment Radio, a podcast series on bacterial and social fermentation. Fermentation can incite social action, spark creativity, and bring surprising new tastes to our lives. My name is Aga Pokrivka, and I invite you to join us in a conversation on living interconnectivities, from macro to micro, from societal to cellular, and from global to personal. This episode is about a more personal side of fermentation, where the borders between life and work, what is private and what is public, blur and come together in a self-contained bubble. While we may transform our own kitchen into a lab for experimentation, its most inherent features stay in place: food preparation and hospitality. In fermentation, as in other kitchen processes, you mix things together and then basically you just wait. It is in this time in between when conversations emerge, thoughts flow, and ideas flourish. Scottish artist-organizer Andrew Gryf Paterson calls it Kitchen Lab, and it takes place in his own kitchen at home in Helsinki. Andrew and I go way back, and we have collaborated together in a number of projects, among them Ferment Lab. Let's take it from there. Well, we have a history of working together on Ferment Lab, and after years of working together, Ferment Lab is kind of in a standby mode, I would say, but it seems that you took the word lab from it and I took ferment and we started to do our own things. Therefore, I'm doing Ferment Radio and you are doing Kitchen Lab.
Well, we probably continued to do our fermenting anyway at home. We just didn't need to encourage anyone to do it in public or invite people to do a workshop. And I suppose also last year, maybe when you started to get in mind of doing these podcasts as Ferment Radio, I had imagined last year that I would start doing workshops with people in presence. But because of the last year's restrictions related to coronavirus and the way that we've all had to stay at home more often, none of that happened. And so maybe my own reflections in the last year, especially around Kitchen Lab, came just because it became a private space again that I shared in public through social media.
And here maybe would be my question. Why one, or you in this case, why would you like to invite others to your kitchen and reveal something which usually stays very private?
It's a good question. I suppose it gives a little bit of company for the activity that you might be doing on your own. In my case, I'm in a fortunate position where I live in a shared house, a commune. There are other people living together in this house, but I have my own room and my own kitchen within the same room. And so it's become a sort of self-contained bubble of a studio space where I do work, a living space where I live and rest and sleep, and a place where I also am cooking. The kitchen can be a space which anyway is part of an everyday life, part of an everyday practice, to nourish yourself, to feed yourself. It has in many cultures been the centre space of a home and the centre space for guests and for conversation. And so actually, even if over the years I have quite often had a kitchen and currently a studio as well as kitchen together, which I live in my own, it's also quite commonly the first place you might invite someone to be in. And that's also a space where you might have the most important conversations.
Your kitchen lab is like any kitchen, but kind of named and reflected upon.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, maybe in other periods of life and other times, I wouldn't have needed to focus my practice into that one space. It is certainly a space at the moment which many people have, but they may not think that it's worth sharing.
What are the current ongoings of the kitchen lab, or what are the most remarkable happenings in the kitchen lab?
Last year, and especially I would say from the start of the spring onwards, there were several occasions where this studio kitchen living space became the site for long distance remote exchanges through video conferencing. And this started first with some experiences with my daughter, who last year was 8, and doing remote cooking with them, like baking with them through video calls. And then there was another exchange which arguably professionalized this a little bit in a playful way with the Global Bacteria Network, in particular with Mark Duce from Zurich, who at the time in early April was making a cross-cultural, multi-locational workshop in Okinawa, the Japanese island. And as one of the remote contributors, I offered to make a very traditional Finnish pie called risi piraka, or it's a Eastern Finnish style pie which is made of rice. It has a rye dough which is very flat, and the edges of it are sort of folded in, and it looks like a sort of moccasin style, and it's a oval shape. And this is a very classic Finnish food. It's very easy to make. It has a cultural heritage from Karalia, an eastern side of Finland and northwest Russia. For Finns, it's an everyday food. And what I was interested in, and especially in this sort of live remote video call, is how can that recipe transfer between one place to another, knowing that there's not the same ingredients on both sides. And on my side, I made the pies, and they said they made their pies, and of course they didn't turn out the same. And the fun of making them differently at the same time, in real time, was a extraordinary kitchen lab.
How long was that exchange? Because it sounds like a slow TV experience.
It was about 6 hours. And of course, if you consider there's the pre-live time together and the post-live time together, it took up the whole day. Our whole process extended a little bit longer than we wished. But from that, it reminded me that when you watch a kitchen video or kitchen TV where you learn a recipe, of course it's edited, right? They've always prepared something earlier, which they pull out from below the counter.
Yeah, and this cake is always cooked, like baked immediately.
Because nobody's going to watch a TV program for several hours for the real-time lens of baking or cooking. But when you have the real-time period, you have downtime where you just sit around waiting for something to happen. Of course, the thing to bake, cook, the oven to preheat even. And that gives you a space to talk about something else.
To me, it also sounds like it's about also experimenting with the tool itself, which is like online communication, whatever you use. We are so used to seeing, people like from their neck up and, I don't know, having kind of quite conventional conversations, I would say. But what will happen like if you start to cook together?
Maybe TV cooking shows are done without chaos because they have a particular amount of time. They want to show a good result to encourage the person to make it. You're not going to create a situation where you might get a total mess or it might fail. You probably want to transmit or share one recipe that works, not many recipes that might work. Especially in our last year of spending much time remotely and mediated through video calls or audio listening, then we have to think about how can we communicate the process of being together, eating together, making together, exploring food together in this remote distance and mediated way.
I got attracted to what you said before about that the oven is heating up or something else has to take time, so we need to sit down and talk or do whatever else. It is a little bit like in fermentation, right? That you put things together in a jar, and then there is this time frame which is kind of passive, but on the other hand things are happening. Maybe here I come to the question is like, since you also, or Kitchen Lab also contains some fermentation practices, do you also consider this time frame where fermentation happens as this kind of a Kitchen Lab experimentation time space?
Oh yeah. There was another experience from almost a year ago now where on Valentine's Day I invited a few friends to join me to make a sauerkraut for Valentine's Day. And the pleasure of this one was that I had a big plastic basin and that the sauerkraut was made by stomping on it with your feet. And this is something that you and I have some experience together with, so we know about this. But it turned out that a few years before, I had done exactly the same on my own. I'd made a Valentine's Day sauerkraut by stamping on it with my feet. And I thought, well, that's a nice combination. Very romantic idea of what sauerkraut could be.
Getting intimate with a crowd.
Getting the juices between your toes, that type of thing. I thought, well, this would be a fun way to have a small friend party on that day, because it takes the situation into a new way, new dimension. And then I put it into the crock. I have one of those large German 5-litre crocks for fermentation, and it's still there.
You didn't try it yet?
No.
You should open it up on Valentine's Day. It is coming up in 10 days or something.
Yeah, actually it's not true. I did taste it. And so there was another pot made a little bit afterwards when the shutdown happened in Finland for the first time. And I thought, I won't open it up until the shutdown's lifted. It's also still some of it's taken away. But that type of, what's the reason for you opening it up? How long should it last for? Is there a special occasion, as you say, a 1-year anniversary of Valentine's Day would be a good occasion to clean out the pot?
You should maybe invite the same group of people and consume.
Actually, I don't want to, because if you know the style of crock, there's a little water moat around the lid, and because of the warmth inside a room, of course, it evaporates gradually. So every time the water evaporates down to the level where you can smell the thing.
Did it smell good though?
No, I'm actually not encouraged to open up.
That's just such a fantastic metaphor. I am really I'm thinking of this the St. Valentine's crock that you did something together. It's kind of encapsulated moment or some effect of that time you spent together. And each time when it wants to return to you with its smell, you pour a little bit of water because you are not ready to take it. I think it's such a beautiful metaphor, isn't it?
I know, it can't go on forever though. I have not been making any new big batches of ferments for this reason too.
Because the crock is busy.
Because both of them are full. Yeah. Or semi-full.
Andrew, you have to let go in order to let the new things happen.
You're so right. You're so right. I mean, this is certainly one process that should end. I can tell you about another thing that I got up to before summer also. It was in June. It relates to something which you know about too, because it was 2016. We were involved together in a project in Dusseldorf, this Planet B. And Planet B was a residency. There was one workshop process that happened there which I did for the first time. I had done a deep frying workshop, and for people who are not familiar from Scotland, there's a reputation of deep frying food and hot oils, but for me, it's not very often that I actually cook and make deep fried things. But I thought it was quite an interesting performance to do, and it's a very interesting process to invite people into, especially if they don't normally do it, because it has a bit of danger. Like hot oil with 10 centimetres of oil at least has a little bit of danger. So there was an occasion where in a nice Sunday afternoon on the steps of a art gallery, or actually it was a Kunsthalle, so a sort of art institution which many public would visit. I made a deep frying workshop for kids. And normally you would do this in the kitchen. I did it on the steps of the institution, and passers-by would walk into the galleries wondering what is going on there. And I was with kids trying to encourage them to deep fry battered vegetables and such like. Going back to last summer, it turned out it was like the 4 years anniversary of it, something like this, and I thought it'd be really nice to do that again. And so I set up on my own house steps, deep fat pot, hot plate, etc., and deep fried some vegetables also. And I decided I wanted to invite some of the same friends to be attending, and at least one turned up, so this was good. And a few more were more amused by my activity to reenact it. But that gives me another example. Do I want to keep doing that every year? Is this something that I want to regularly do as a memory of that first event and that time that a group of us had together? And does it become a ritual that I want to recreate on a regular basis? Do I keep that one special for I'll only deep fry on the steps of a building? Or I always will invite that person every time I do a deep fry occasion? There was another side to it which is maybe interesting for me as a performative act, in that on the first occasion in Dusseldorf, we deep fried one of the small booklets related to the exhibition, and I thought, well, that was sort of fun. It was a sort of irreverent approach to the occasion we were in, and maybe a finalising part of the process because it was the end of the 2 weeks. But to deep fry a small booklet of paper turns the hot oil and the deep frying tradition, if you can call it that, into another transformative process. It encapsulates, it literally soaks in oil and fries an object so you can't use it again. And the book you can't read again, and you might as well throw away. But that process of cooking it, literally cooking the books, is sort of gives you another way to think about how do you remember things. Do you decide that that's an archival act or a performative act to remember by destroying it? And so the last summer when I did the deep frying again, I decided to deep fry another catalogue from 10 years before as another memorial act, a celebration, you could argue, right? And it makes me think okay, this is definitely not about cooking anymore. It's about using the processes of cooking and about using practices that we might be familiar with in our cultural heritage, where you come from. In my case, this was a Glaswegian memory from Glasgow. And when we cook food and make food on a regular basis, maybe annually as a special occasion, then you create a ritual. And for me, I'm just borrowing those practices from the kitchen and from our eating habits into other performative practices, archival practices.
But I think that eating and preparing food is such a potent kind of a field for creating rituals, because even this, that, I don't know, many people eat breakfast or dinner, it's already a ritual. You do it like every day if you have like a regular eating plan, let's say. And then there are seasonal foods, and what if you overwrite it with your own kind of ideas? But it also made me think that you have extensive experience as working as in a cultural field, as a producer, cultural worker. This is how I would call it. One could argue that we also culture food when, for example, we ferment, or if we grow plants to be eaten, or if you keep your worms in the kitchen. It's all about culturing. And I wanted to ask you, what is your reflection between those two processes, since they are evidently connected through that word?
Well, I mean, it's quite natural that they blended together. Let's say the practice of being a cultural worker has just blended with my everyday life. And that's where the art, in my case, is being a cultural organizer and using my interests in participatory and social arts. That these things are quite naturally combined anyway, and that blends easily into the eating culture and the culturing of food, or culturing of an ecosystem to produce food or to process waste, etc. So these things are blurring quite naturally for me, but they also relate to bringing the practices of my type of art towards food and towards eating and fermenting and composting and things like that.
You referred, during this conversation, quite a lot to the things I read in your paper. Your paper has a title, Spilling One's Guts, exactly. Yeah. And it's kind of a phrase in English, right?
It is, yeah.
I have a feeling there is many of this kind of phrases which relate to eating or kitchen or food, which actually express other things, related to emotions and life in general. What would that be?
Well, that's quite tricky, isn't it? Is a phrase which is referring a lot to like vomiting, arguably, right, at first, but also a cleansing process, a confessional even, and the idea that you reveal everything, and that somehow clears the gut, makes things better, right?
I am just talking from my own kind of viewpoint as a native Polish speaker. Yeah. In Polish, there's so many expressions in everyday life which relate to food.
Please tell me.
When you eat a fish and the fish bone stuck in your throat. This, for example, could be an expression. There is many expressions about liver, since liver is organ which is related to emotions and anger.
The phrases around your guts and your gut feeling
exactly
is one which I really appreciate. And of course, it's backed up nowadays in contemporary times by science, that people are understanding much more the relationship between your microbiome in your gut and your emotions and your mood. I like to think that people who work as artists have for a long time used intuition and gut feelings in their practice, but haven't had necessarily a good way to explain it beyond those terms. Things that you do and the things that you might think about are influenced by a creativity beyond yourself. When we go back to this idea of what is there to spill, right? So one of the motivations in writing the paper you referred to was to try and talk about the things beyond the frame. I'm interested in bricolage, working with what you have, the materials that you have, and making something from that, the assemblage of different things that you might have, and making do with what you've got. Sort of make do situation that these limitations can allow you to do things that you might not have thought about in advance, because this is all there is. That's what you're going to try and make something with.
I think something I also appreciate a lot from your paper is that you also do not treat as given that somebody has a kitchen, or you kind of put a remark on that, or what is actually home. You wrote I think sentence which was quite powerful, that the home is a place where you want to stay.
I mean, the experiences I had over the 5 years, which was the reference for that article we speak of, included periods where I didn't have a home, where I borrowed other people's kitchens, where I had my own kitchen but I didn't live there officially, where I was in artist residence in some other place for a month. And these all created circumstances which reminded me that there's some basic things that you need in order first.
Coming to the quotes from your paper, I also wrote down here one which goes like, everything passes, all ferments, falls apart and is recycled. Change is our only constant. It will not always be like this. You are not alone. You might be solitary, but not always. I find it very beautiful.
Thank you. This type of article is also one which is written in a style where it's possible to be a little bit poetic. It includes personal information, and as an academic paper, it references to what's called autoethnography, where you try to contextualize a practice or a scene or a community using your own personal perspective. And for me, it gave affordance to tell about personal things, and also to try and open up the areas which are part of the work, but people might not talk about or might not reveal. And that's where the spilling of the guts was, right?
Since, when you talk about kitchen and cooking, it's a lot about recipes, and recipe is like inherently open sourcing of the knowledge. Maybe I would like to give a little bit space to that, because I think it's very important in your practice.
So for 15 to almost 20 years, I've been interested in or influenced by open and free culture, and the open source movement, as I knew of it in the early 2000s, has influenced a lot the way I like to do things. And but maybe others don't know that I use Internet Archive as essentially a portfolio archive, and that means that I try to put as much of my work online with Commons license as possible. So in that sense, I feel like that's a give back for what I take from the open and free cultural scenes. And that's my contribution to arguably society, right? If I receive public funding, then it's nice to give it back this way. Recipes, as you mentioned, is like been part of that cultural heritage for a long time. It's also been privatized. It's also been re-put back into the commons after becoming privatized. Some of the recipes that we might think are classics from the places we come from were originally a private recipe that has been written down, copied into some other book, and eventually sold. We're always arguably in a spectrum between private knowledge and open knowledge when it comes to food. We are balancing always the recipes between the private personal version of things, which you could commoditize, and the version that everybody knows generally and changes according to their circumstances or use. I mean, recipes are for me at least, just a set of guidelines which you can then change. And I'm personally not using recipes very often, except as inspiration.
Usually if I follow the recipe, I never read it in advance. So I kind of read it as a book and I'm like, oh no, and I have to do this now? I think that brings some more of a thrill, that I am not prepared what will happen next. So it's like reading a novel.
I have a cookbook which was, of course, most people have a cookbook that was given to them by a relative. But I know that the copy of the cookbook I have is the same copy that my mum has. And so you can have an interesting sort of generational exchange on this basis. And then I can, of course, pass it on to the next generation. I have a cookbook also from the place I used to work when I worked in a kitchen in Glasgow. So this is a collection of recipes. Some of them were classics that I used to make on a regular basis every week. And it's a curious bundle of memories, all these things. And I think that's another interesting side of at least the personalised collection of recipe books, that they actually might relate to your own personal history and your own memories. And if they were gifts from relatives, for example, the meals that you might have ate in different times in your life. And that becomes a really interesting collection. It's a totally different one than the commodified celebrity book that is very popular and common in our last 20, 30 years.
Do you have like the notebook where you write by hand your recipes?
No, I don't write down recipes. I don't really use recipes.
But it could be like a diary of, processes.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, the recipes can, of course, always be starting points for other things, for ideas and concepts and things like that. I mean, we have some experience of making recipes together. When we made our Ferment Lab Strasbourg project together, we had a workshop where we invited people to make different types of ferments using the various ingredients that we had given them. And they made the jars of ferments, and some of them came back the next week and tried to taste them, and the recipe was made retroactively. What did they think was there? What could they taste? And so recipes could happen in advance. You could write them down as you make them, but you could also try to invent them based on what you are fronted with. What you taste and go, oh, what could that be made of? And retroactively, you make the recipe. Fermentation is a process, and it's one which takes time, can end up in different ways than what you imagined. So it has a smell, it has a taste. But here we are talking about these things. So we have representations of that practice, which is stories, questions, answers, anecdotes, that type of thing like we have now. But it's still very difficult to get a complete picture of things.
Isn't it sometimes so that somebody is telling about some dish and you start to salivate? It sometimes happens, right? And I think this is like a good example of how story can be very, actually motivate other senses to activate, And I don't think anybody was salivating today, listening to what we were talking about. But I really hope that some other senses and some other areas of at least thinking or reflecting can be activated. If you would like to dive deeper into this topic, you can always have a look at Andrew's paper, Kitchen Labs Spilling One's Gut, Deep Fried Together, which we were referring to in this conversation and which will be available in the forthcoming publication of Research in Art and Education. Oh, by the way, Andrew's Valentine's Day sauerkraut is already gone. The one that is still fermenting in his kitchen dates from March 2020, and it marks the first coronavirus lockdown in Finland. It looks like this one might take a little more time to get sorted out. If you would like to know more about the show, listen to this episode again, or find previous episodes, please go to fermentradio.com. You can subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and more. I'm always looking forward to hearing from you at hello@fermentradio.com. Ferment Radio is brought to you by Culture of Cultures and is produced by Super Eclectic. Thank you for listening. Keep fermenting and stay tuned for the next episode of Ferment Radio.